So this is the celebration. We will start with Elizabeth Bilson, who was the Administrative Director of the Department of Astronomy and Space Sciences. And she will tell you a bit about the two brief videos that we're going to see. And then we will hear from Patrick Burns and Joe Burns. And then we will retire to the living room for some wine and cider. So I hope you have a fine afternoon, and welcome to Kendal.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me and I do this well. Before we play the video, louder, is that okay? All right? Okay. So I would like to tell you the story of the video you are going to see in a few minutes. More than a decade ago, I think it was the beginning of 2008, when I already was retired and a woman of leisure, I turned on the internet, actually my email, and I see probably this beautiful picture of Saturn circulated by Professor Joe Burns. And I immediately wrote to Joe Burns and said, this is not only fantastic science, but it's so aesthetically pleasing. The place of a picture like that is in a fine art museum. I think Joe already thought about this, and with his artist wife, Judy, they spent enormous amount of energy and know-how and prepared an exhibit of the Cassini pictures of Saturn, its rings, its moons, and mounted exhibits of very large scales of these photographs, many feet by many feet, in New York's Museum of Natural History and in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. The last step in these exhibits was going to be, with Frank Robinson's help, an exhibit in the Howard Johnson Museum at Cornell. So I learned that by coincidence, the big annual meeting of planetary sciences of the American Astronomical Society was going to be taking place here at Cornell. And one of the evening entertainment planned was a concert by the joint Cornell and Ithaca College orchestras playing the famous piece Planets by Walt. And the feature was going to be that the astronomy graduate students selected beautiful pictures by various missions of the planets, and those pictures were going to be projected on a giant screen behind the orchestra at Bailey Hall. So I told myself, but we have these beautiful pictures of Saturn, what will we do with them? And I asked Joe whether I could investigate if Roberto Sierra, Cornell faculty composer, would be interested in writing a piece inspired by the Cassini pictures. So he came over to Joe's workroom, and Joe's research associate, Matt Hedman, prepared a beautiful sequence of photographs. So very soon, Roberto Sierra said yes. He was going to write a piece for orchestra and percussion soloist, who was Tim Finney, a very good player, we had at that time. So the evening of the Bailey Hall concert came about, and it was really great fun because that big hall was completely filled up already half an hour before the concert was scheduled. And the Anillos, the piece Roberto wrote was called Anillos, rings in Spanish. And that piece was played very well by the orchestra, and those beautiful pictures looked even more beautiful on the giant screen at Bailey Hall. Then the planet piece was played, and there was a noisy standing ovation, long standing ovation followed the concert. So Joe was told by many participants that this is the type of entertainment which should be taking place after every conference. And Joe said, well, that was going to be some feat to accomplish. And the only thing I would like to say that when it was all over, I was a little sad, so now that's it. I asked, and we raised some money and found time and made a video out of the Anillos project, a video which also contains a wonderful speech by Joe Burns, which you will like very much. So here is the time to play Anillos.
The video starts with what looks like a strange set of symbols, but keep in mind we're also celebrating the 400th anniversary of the first use of the telescope by Galileo. In the wintertime of 1610, he was looking at the planet and the arms of the rings sitting out on either side, but his telescope was so crude that he picked this out to be three separate bodies. It took 50 years before Christian Huygens realized that what you were looking at was a central sphere like a good planet ought to be, but it had this magnificent, majestic ring system around it. This is one of those mosaics taken from a great distance, and then we piece together the various images. These are all natural, real colors. We just combined three separate color images in order to get this. This, I think, is a good illustration of why, again, you want to do space exploration. You get up close, you see things in much greater detail, but you can also see perspectives that you aren't able to see from the Earth. Saturn only moves back and forth across the sky by 6 degrees, so you don't see very much around the sides of anything. You don't see the polar regions. Now we have a chance to view all that and understand the three-dimensional structure of the system. Here we're looking at the sun is just behind the planet at about 7 o'clock, peeking over the limb there. You see the upper atmosphere illuminated. It's an unusual image because what you're looking at is the rings splayed out on either side of the planet, but then some of the sunlight comes and strikes this side of the ring and reflects back into the shadowed planet and illuminates what should be the dark planet. And then it reflects back out to the camera and passes through the rings in order to reach the cameras. And so you see the ring both in illumination but also in silhouette simultaneously, and your eye sort of goes like that. So there's science in this, but it's also there's mystery, and it's otherworldly. I mean, it really is out of this world. And as the National Geographic said, it's Saturn as we've never seen it before. The thin line is the very thin ring system. In fact, if it were shown in true thickness, you wouldn't even be able to see it. We're catching it at a little bit of an edge. We know that the system is made up of lots of particles. And so these things you might think would just, orbit in random directions around the planet. But of course, if you've got enough of them, then they start to run into one another. And as they run into one another, they tend to flatten down into one plane, and they lose energy, but they've got to continue to carry this angular momentum in a physical sense. And so the combination of losing energy and saving angular momentum means that the system flattens and spreads as wide as it can possibly spread. This has gone a long way here, so that we've gotten a system down to being just 30 feet thick, even though it extends for several 100,000 miles. It's sort of like if you were to take a sheet of tissue paper and spread it across a football field, say, and then take 1,000 slices of it. It's about that thickness. In this image, we're seeing the main expanse of the rings, and within that are two black lines. Sitting inside of each of those is a moonlet, and the gaps are in fact created by these moons pushing aside the ring. The bigger moon makes a bigger hole. The little moon on the outside makes this little narrow gap. In this image, you see the rings pass in front of the satellite Titan. In the background here, the outer edge of the ring system, you see there's a narrow thread on the top and the bottom. That's the F ring, which encompasses the entire ring system. One would not have expected to see anything so narrow, and we now know it has two little moons on either side that are pushing the particles together and keeping them in that narrow thread. This ring had been thought to be made up of very small ice particles, but now we see embedded within the core there are big chunks of material. And we've started calling them, because they come and go, we call them cats. These are two little moons, the little moons that surround this F ring, and they're interesting bodies in their own right. The moon you see in the background here looks bland. The reason it looks bland is it's got an incredibly dense atmosphere. It's the moon Titan. very difficult to observe from the ground because of the opacity of the atmosphere. But from spacecraft, we're able to carry aboard certain filters that allow us to look through that haze. So we now have a reasonably good idea of what Titan is like, and it's a very, very interesting place. That's the upper atmosphere of Titan, and it's layered and made out of various organic molecules. These are some of the images that were taken by the Huygens probe camera. We wanted to be able to look through that haze and see whether or not we would see things like lakes. We've in fact found lakes in the North Polar region. We're quite certain they're ethane and methane lakes, and they're of substantial size. They're sizes of the Great Lakes here on Earth. So this is a magnificent image and just pretty amazing science. Here's a little moon, Enceladus, and when we got there, we found that this was at the core of a faint ring system looking back toward the sun over the limb of this satellite. We see this material spewing out. So we've got some heating mechanism that's driving geysers. And those geysers come right out of those blue cracks in the South Polar region. But again, an incredible place. Who would have predicted something like this? And you got to go there to see it. I think there are really close connections between art and science. You know, in both cases, you need to be aware of what's happened in the past. You need to have some understanding of what previous accomplishments have been, and you build on those experiences. But you're also trying to give some sense of your view of the world. And mine maybe is a mechanistic, but it's an understandable world. But I am still trying to explore myself and explore the world around me. When I look at these spacecraft images, I have lots of different responses. They are remarkably beautiful to me. They're graphically beautiful. You've got very crisp lines, you've got perfect spheres and planes, and they're just beautiful, beautiful things. And you realize this place is 10 times as far from the sun as the Earth is, and to people of the generations before us, these were little specks of light. And look what we're seeing. If you ask a third grade class, draw something from space, 98% of them are going to be planets with rings. They're all Saturn because they're beautiful. And they're not only beautiful, but they say something about the way the processes that went on back when the solar system was put together. So we can look at these processes, the processes out of which the solar system was born, in real life. And having images like this are a great aid in us understanding the very complex dynamics. Space is not only a metaphor for discovery, but also for exploration and for the future. And that's been important in the fabric of our society. And the space program is what we have left. I mean, America was all about the frontier. Well, the frontier right now is out there. These images allow us a chance to really tell our science story. And I think it's important to convince the general public that the space program is important. It gives us a perspective on who we are as a species. It gives us a chance to teach some science and to excite some young students and hopefully make the world a better place when we're gone.
Wasn't that great? The DVD will be available in the library for people to borrow. Is that right, Elizabeth? Yeah. And it's also the case that PBS has recently done a series through Nova, and one of the segments is on Saturn. And Marguerite Uphoff has bought a copy of that. That'll be available in the library, and we will probably be running that just out in the hall without sound while we have our wine. But first, there are a couple more pieces. I'm going to ask Patrick Burns to come up and make his comments about his parents and their efforts in this. And then Joe has a few words to say to you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Any better? Yes. Great. Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Burns, Joe and Judy's son. I'd like to start with a thank you to Gail Cashin, Elizabeth Bielsen, and Marguerite Uphoff, and Frank Robinson for making this happen. It really means a lot to us. For my sake and for yours, I will not attempt to describe the Cassini space mission, because despite growing up with an astronomer in the house, I still can't identify Orion, the moon, or for that matter, any ring that's not around somebody's finger. Instead, I will focus on the collaboration between my parents, which brought Spectacular Saturn to the public. Like most children, I made sense of the world by observing my parents' lives, experiences, and values. My mother graduated at the top of her class from Washington University in St. Louis, received her MFA from Cornell, and spent her professional life as a graphic designer at the university. Her artwork graced the walls of our house and many other homes in Ithaca. She was creative, intelligent, curious, hardworking, and talented. My father, who had 4 brothers, had only one pathway to college: find a school that would take him and pay his tuition. After getting a perfect score on his SATs, he was accepted to Webb Institute on Long Island, a small naval architecture school focused on ship design. After 4 years, he went to Cornell, where he received his PhD in space mechanics. Shortly thereafter, he joined the faculty, where he spent his entire professional career in theoretical and applied mechanics, mechanical engineering, and astronomy, retiring just 3 years ago after a series of strokes. As you can probably imagine, with parents like Joe and Judy, a child trying to develop his own identity and find his place in the world might experience a tiny bit of pressure, intimidation, and even resentment. The temperaments and styles of my mom and dad were distinctly different. My mom was design-oriented, whereas my dad struggled every morning to match his shirts, pants, and socks. He thought balancing the checkbook was fun, an exercise that sent smoke billowing from my mother's ears. Nonetheless, in 2009, as the Cassini space program was producing stunningly beautiful photographs of Saturn, which my dad and his colleagues were analyzing in real time, my parents decided to pool their talents and collaborate on an exhibit the public would enjoy and benefit from. With my mom as the creative lead and my dad as the scientific guru, they launched Spectacular Saturn. Over the next few years, the exhibit made the rounds at the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, a real treat for my father, who recalled visiting as a young kid, as well as the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the MOST in Syracuse, and of course, thanks to Frank Robinson, the Johnson Art Museum here at Cornell. Needless to say, Spectacular Saturn was a spectacular success. My dad frequently tells me how proud of me he is, and there's probably nothing more touching than hearing him say that. However, today I have a chance to give voice to the pride I have in my parents, to celebrate their contributions to society, and most importantly, to remember the wonderful relationship they had with one another. So with that, I introduce the man of the hour, Joe Burns.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for taking the time and interest to view the most beautiful planet in the solar system, Saturn. As my son mentioned, I have suffered a series of strokes. And I apologize in advance for any difficulty you have in understanding my language. Okay. I'm Joe Burns, and the Cassini space mission was the core composite of my professional life for about 30 years. Any kid is asked, if any kid is asked to draw a planet 9 times out of 10, he will choose Saturn. And I personally don't want that to change. My name is Joe Burns. It's down here.
Yep.
So much was and still is being done scientifically that to the sake of time, my son forced me only to mention a few highlights. Here are a few key features and achievements of the space mission that might interest you. The mission was funded at $5 to $6 million and shared by NASA and the Space Agency, the European Space Agency. It had more than 150 team members, as well as an additional 100 engineers. The teams were divided by discipline and included categories like the Rings group, the Satellites group, the Magnetosphere group, the Titan group, the Saturn group, and the infrared teams, which Bill Nilsson and Peter Girish here today are members of, as well as the imaging team, which I was a member of. We selected 10 Americans, of which 4 were at Accord. Peter Thomas, Joe Verica, Steve Squires, and myself were among the members. The spacecraft itself was the size of a small school bus and weighing in at about 5 or 6 tons. The spacecraft was powered by 2 RTGs, radial thermal generators, which are nuclear reactors. These 2 provided power to the spacecraft for 20 years. 7 of which were spent getting out to Saturn. Pretty impressive. There was a computer on the spacecraft that has helped preliminary analyze some data as we were receiving it. In addition, it had a radio transmitter and transmitted data back and forth to Earth. If I had to choose a few things that surprised me about or impressed me about Saturn, they would include the following. Enceladus is a very small satellite. Is incredibly powerful in seeing water geysers, which indicate there could be some possibility of future life. Saturn has 2 satellites embedded in the thin rings. In between the rings. Then another of the moons, and the biggest one by far, has an atmosphere that is 10 times denser than Earth and includes rivers and lakes of methane, and nitrogen. And that's really striking because you've got rivers running together downhill to get into the seas, and you see rainfall on the surface of the satellite, which is, it's not water, it happens to be methane and nitrogen, but it's just like our system on the Earth. We observed many, many rings composed of water ice ranging in size of particles from a piece of dust up to an igloo or something like that. Its rings are composed of water ice contaminated by organic material, which the rings transcends the rings to their extraordinary beauty. Lastly, and most importantly, I want to underscore that I've had a couple of very excellent postdocs helping me with this, Matt Hedman and Matt Tiscarino, and a very talented and loving who's my late wife, Judy Clement Burns, who I miss every day. If you'd like to enjoy more of the photographs of Saturn, there are images in the Space Science Building, especially 301, and we will have an exhibit in my library, hopefully in the fall, that will show the images. And you can also go to the NASA website or the PTS website and look on Planetary Photo Journal. I am happy to do my best to answer any questions as the program is over, once the program is over. Thanks again for taking your time to join us today.